To start off, introduce myself. My name is BJ Swain. I'm the author of a couple books, which at the end I'll give you guys info on those if you'd like, and I'll have the opportunity for people to buy discounted copies. There's also copies available down at the registration area where they're selling books, and they're a little cheaper than they are on Amazon, but not as discounted as I've got them here. I've been involved in magic and paganism and neo-paganism and various sorts of esoteric spiritualities since I was a little kid. So at this point, about 31 years. Spent a lot of time involved in the OTO as far as groups go. Was also part of a Luciferian Catholic organization and trained with a hereditary witch and a branch of the Thelemic AA and various other groups over time as well. So a lot of different things come into play in my background. Divination is not the core of my background, but academically I'm trained as an historian, and so this class is largely looking at kind of the history of tarot cards and how that history informs how we make choices about divination, how we make choices about what sorts of tarot decks we use and how we think about them, and kind of also peels back some of the things that people say about the tarot and the cards and where they come from and what their meaning is. Because the big takeaway is it's all pretty much made up, and it's all super new, new within about the last 200 years or so. And so I personally am a Marseille tarot guy. I like the Tarot de Marseille. And if I'm not using that, I use the Rider Waite Smith deck because it's close to that. And I don't get into all of the various other more specific, exciting ones that people like. And some people take those approaches as really hardline traditionalist approaches, as the Marseille tarot is the tarot and these other things are not tarot. And I'll admit sometimes I kind of lean into that, but even leaning into that, it's all kind of nonsense and silly because all the meanings and all the divination stuff was invented after people started ascribing spiritual meanings to it, which was all way after those decks were created, and they're not really specific to those decks. Most of those ideas, as we'll learn once we get deeper into this, had their own decks that were created for those ideas as they developed. So that's really the short of the class right there. That's it. You guys can all get it. But we're going to talk about a few things on the way there, and I'm going to try to keep it a little bit casual if I can, because again, it's a lot of history stuff, and that's kind of the angle that I come at this from. But if we can kind of just sort of talk about some of these ideas too, then that can make it a little more fun and a little less dry. But to start off with, divination. And I think in magic in general, I'm definitely much more of a magic guy than a divination guy. There's a wide diversity in magic, and people don't always realize that or notice that. And it's not even just that there's all these different traditions or all these different systems, but there's different ways that magical agency works and different ways that people engage magic and are able to experience magic. And the ability to experience magic in different ways might be different for different people or different types of people or people who've had different sorts of experiences. And that's something that doesn't really get talked about. Everyone kind of tries to treat it as it's all the same thing, and everybody's exploring the same thing, but maybe through a slightly different lens or with a different approach, but all roads lead to Rome. Well, no, some roads lead to Carthage if it weren't destroyed, or up further north, or further east, or out into the sea. There's lots of different places that we can go with things. And divination is the same way. There's not one divination. And even if we look at the word divination, what most people mean when they say that they're divining or that they're doing divination isn't even what the word divination means. Frequently, when we talk about divination, we're just thinking about the tool. or maybe we're thinking about kind of the energies of the world around us, or we're thinking about pulling things out of ourselves. But pulling things out of yourself isn't divination. Divination is talking to something divine or some spirit source, something that has knowledge from some realm or place beyond where we are, and it's able to give you information through the tool you're using. And so when we say divination classically, that's what it means. It's getting information from the divine. And when we think about that in an historical context, that wasn't kind of this outsider weirdo fringe thing that people did. It wasn't you're walking down the boardwalk and you see a weird little hut with some carnival person in it who's going to read your future. The idea of taking knowledge from the divine in the medieval and the early modern world was the highest way of gaining knowledge. If you went through the liberal arts, the 7 disciplines that were part of a standard education, that prepared you for studying philosophy. And if you were adequate at philosophy, then you were qualified to study theology. And a lot of those people who became doctors of philosophy and doctors of science, they were also magicians and astrologers and diviners. Isaac Newton spent more time writing about magic and esoteric things than he did about science. And there was a point where that was the expectation, was that you were going to hit a roadblock as far as normal means of knowledge, and you had to pull knowledge from someplace else. And that someplace else was pulling knowledge from the heavens, or maybe sometimes from the dead or from spirits underneath the world. But that wasn't as okay. So that's kind of divination in a classical sense. And so when we think about divination, we're pulling from that same tradition. It's the same tradition of the prophets. It's the same tradition of visionaries who saw the heavens, who heard voices from beyond telling them things. When people pray and receive answers to their prayers, or when we conjure a spirit or we have an apparition and it tells us something, those are all forms of divination. In the ancient world, augury was a huge thing. Um, Before any important activity was set out upon, you had to have the augurs come in and take auguries to see what the gods had to say about it. And there's still people today who do that. I was a financial advisor for a long time, and one of my clients was one of the first Americans to write about traditional feng shui. And she has clients all over the world that are like major corporations who, before they do anything, they will reach out to her and have her do readings on the timing at which they should do the things they're going to do and when they should do these things. Um, I imagine President Reagan is probably not a very popular president at events like this, but President Reagan and Nancy Reagan used electional astrology to make decisions about things that they were going to do. It's something that even in the highest echelons of society today is still something that's there. But a lot of times we kind of talk about it like it's this fringe thing that's out there and only weird people do. But it's always been an important part of the world. And when we think about divination as kind of a diversity of divination, we can kind of remember like, oh yeah, all of these methods of obtaining knowledge from spirits, obtaining knowledge from angels, obtaining knowledge from demons, from ghosts, from gods, that's all part of divination. But that doesn't mean that those other forms of divination aren't. So if your divination is reflective and pulling things from your unconscious, or if it's about restructuring how you're thinking about things that you've perceived and experienced by the way that the tools redirect how you think about things and look at the parts of the situation in your life, that still is a form of divination. It's just kind of a more modern use of the word. And it can still be an important, useful tool. Um, Fortune telling. When we think about divination, a lot of times we think of it as kind of like big stuff. That it's like you're looking for truth, you're looking for some epic answer, you're looking for some big guidance. But a lot of divination throughout all of history has been, how should I handle this situation? How should I deal with this thing that's in front of me? What day should we plan our attack to destroy Carthage? The that's part of divination, and that's really not that different from fortune telling. Uh, when we think about tarot and actually a lot of divination tools that people use commonly today, fortune telling is really what we're thinking about. We're thinking about asking questions about day-to-day life, about the problems that we're experiencing, and about sort of how we should navigate them, like what problems are going to come up, what good things might come up, who's behind the problems that we're having, and how do we get around them or get through them. For a lot of early esoterists and occult revival magicians, they didn't like that. They didn't want that to be what tarot was associated with. They didn't want that to be what their divination was associated with. And an irony to that is, as we get into the history of how the esoteric elements of tarot developed, fortune telling and divination were there before, well, not necessarily before, but kind of right there at the beginning, along with the more esoteric and high-minded ideas. So before we get to the Golden Dawn wanting tarot to be this big spiritual thing, the divination part was already there, and the people that were influencing them were influenced by those people that wanted divination to be part of what tarot was doing. Um, Whether we're approaching divination as a sort of spiritual practice or seeking enlightenment or seeking sort of greater knowledge or understanding about ourselves or the world, or we're approaching it from a fortune telling perspective, either way, we can engage that diversity of options for divination. We can look at it as, all right, we're going to call upon some god and then we're going to use the tool to interpret what the god's telling us. We're going to conjure a spirit and use the tool for the spirit to speak through. We're going to reflect on our inner awareness and use the tool to tease things out of our inner awareness. All of those things can be applied whether we're doing fortune telling or we're doing something that's a bigger, more spiritual sort of divination approach. The Another way that tarot gets used in modern spirituality, aside from just methods of divination or fortune telling, is for self development and reflection. Um, a lot of the occult revival ideas around tarot looked at tarot as a key to unlocking mysteries and a key to initiation. And that's not quite the same as what we're necessarily doing when we approach it for self development or as a reflection tool, but it can be similar. So sometimes people approach it where they'll look at a card and determine, like, okay, this is the card that represents me at this time in my life, or this is the card that I'm aspiring to, and I'm going to use this card as a guide to how to get to that place where I'm embodying the ideas of this card. Or I'm going to go through a series of meditations where I'm exploring the ideas of the cards and how they play out in my life, or how they play out in myself, or how I can balance the positive and negative meanings of these cards in my life and how I act within the world. This time of year in particular is kind of pertinent to that for anyone from a Thelemic background because it's the Thelemic holy season. And so from the equinox up to the 3 days of the writing of the Book of the Law in the beginning of April, Thelemites will assign a trump card to each day, and then they'll do scrying meditations on the trump cards or reflections on the trump cards or readings that relate to those trump cards. And so it's basically similar to that same sort of process of exploring the cards of a way of unfolding yourself and kind of guiding yourself and your self-development. So we can see that in the modern world, there's a lot of different ways to use the tarot esoterically. Almost no one is using the tarot to play the game of trumps and play a card game with them. But we can use them for divination. We can use them for divination on a spiritual level or a fortune telling level. We can use it for initiation. We can use it for reflection. We can use it as an archetypal tool for guiding ourselves. So there's a lot of different ways we can use it. And we have to understand what we want out of the tarot to decide which way we want to use it or which ways. Maybe we want to use it in different ways at different times. But as we're doing that, we also need to understand which deck is going to be best for us for that particular goal. And for people who are using it for multiple goals, you might find that certain decks work better for one thing or another. Like the Marseille deck, really good for fortune telling. maybe not as good for meditating on spiritual meanings of the cards. But the Rider-Waite-Smith deck has all that built into it on purpose for you to do that. Or the Thoth deck definitely has all that built into it. It's really nothing but that. And then a lot of the different modern tarots, they're going to have different spins on those sorts of things. And so maybe one of those is going to be better for you on a personal level as far as understanding and unfolding yourself, because maybe the things that Crowley thought were important in building the Thoth deck are really not things that have anything to do with you and your life and your worldview. But maybe one of the Witches' tarots is. And that might be the deck that really speaks to you for that purpose of understanding your path through life. Whereas another deck might be better for you for actual fortune telling and divination purposes. And I think that's one of the things that you get a lot of people who they will get a bunch of different decks and they'll talk about, okay, this deck has this feel, or this deck has this voice, or this deck has pictures that I like. And so the level of digging into what the deck is and what the deck means is often not there when people are deciding what deck they want to use for what purpose. Because a lot of times we're not looking at this as something where there are different purposes that we could be using them for, and there are different areas of our lives that these could be important for. But that's absolutely necessary if you really want to explore this. And to me personally, understanding that and unpacking that ties into unpacking the history of how the tarot kind of developed into what it is, because that thinking is going to inform us about how those decks were built and why they were built the way they were. And then we can use that to unpack how more modern decks are built and what the creators of those decks are bringing to the table and how those creators speak to us specifically and speak to our needs specifically. But before we get to that history, we kind of have to look at what it is when we're talking about a tarot deck, because you could have a tarot deck or you could have an oracle deck. And different people use those terms differently. And again, I can be one of those like jerky Marseille tarot guys who's like, nope, that dragon tarot is not tarot because the pictures are not designed with the same symbols that the Marseille tarot is. The dragon tarot was actually the first tarot deck that I had when I was like 14 years old. And so you get some people who say that everything like that should be called an oracle deck, or everything like that should be called a cartomancy deck. And unless it fits into the historical styles of tarot, or you could have modern art styles, but the same symbol sets and same story being told that's told in the historical tarot, then all of that's tarot. But these other things aren't. You'll get other people who say anything that has the right number of cards and has more or less the same trumps and has four suits, and the suits maybe can change or maybe they need to be the same. All of that can be tarot. But if you start breaking out of that structure of the trumps and the suits, then you're getting into oracle decks. There's different opinions people have on that. And I think without looking at the history of it, those opinions can seem really important. When you start looking at the fact that the history of this was just a bunch of guys making up fake history, those opinions start to matter a whole lot less. Yeah, and I tend to be one of those stickler types about things like that. And this is one where I'm like, now that I know more about where this came from, do you have fun? And so it kind of takes away some of the question of looking at, okay, is this tarot or is this tarot? But it doesn't take away the question of what does this tarot say versus what does that tarot say, and how does that apply to what you're looking for? Now, if we dive into the basic history of tarot, on the one hand, we will get a little detailed. But on the other hand, we kind of have to keep it somewhat simple. And part of the reason for keeping it simple, no one knows. There's very few good sources on tarot history, at least academic sources on tarot history. There's a lot of hobbyist sources, a lot of people from playing card enthusiast communities have written about the history of tarot. There's also a lot of people from esoteric communities that have written on the history of tarot. and a lot of them come up with very different conclusions because of what they're looking at. But there are very few comprehensive, academically sourced texts. And so that creates sort of a convoluted look at the history. A lot of historians will admit that we're not really sure where tarot started or how the earliest decks formed. The nice thing with that is that you can kind of look at the history sort of generally, and you don't have to get super bogged down in it, but you can look at it enough to inform what you're doing. The more fun thing is there are actually a couple sources that really do break it down and make really solid cases for their arguments. So they are out there. There's just not a lot of them. And we are going to draw from one of them. Before we get to that history, let's get into some fantasy, because that will be way more fun. So there are probably several of you here who have heard some version of this story. Some of you may even believe that it's actually true. And if you did believe that it is true, I'm sorry. Because it's going to sound like I'm saying something isn't real, but it's not. So the version of this that I like is kind of influenced by the way that Thelema tells this story, and I don't really consider myself a Thelemite anymore, even though I was like in an OTO body for 19 years and was like the longest running body master of any OTO body, deputy body master of any OTO body for like 13 years. But they do tell a good story in this regard. So once upon a time, there was a group of evil adepts, and they decided that they wanted to have all of the power and all of the secrets themselves. And so they cast the great sorcery over the world. Hint, in Thelema, the great sorcery is Christianity. And they used this great sorcery to ensnare everyone in a spiritual misdirection that would have enough elements of truth that it could kind of keep people going, but the real truth was hidden deep within in the esoteric areas and prevented from being seen by the outward forms of the great sorcery. But there were also good adepts who understood that this would be bad for the world and that the mysteries of initiation and the keys to those mysteries needed to survive. And so they convened a great meeting and decided that they would preserve all of the mysteries and secrets and teachings of the adepts. And half of them thought that they should be written into a book, into a magic book that would explain them. And those adepts went forth and they created a magic book, which the Sworn Book of Honorius claims to be. So if anyone wants to read a book that claims to be that, you can get a very good translation of the Sworn Book of Honorius by Joseph Peterson. The others felt that it would be best to hide the secrets in plain sight and use art to hide them in a game that people could play, and no one would understand that these were actually the ancient keys to the mysteries of initiation and the eternal truth. And they created the tarot and dispersed the tarot through the world as a game for people to play, unaware that these people were actually holding on to the secrets of the mysteries. Now, that's a really fun story, but it's absolute nonsense. None of it is real, mostly. Um, these ideas kind of come from 18th and 19th century thinkers, and the ideas are often blamed on Egyptomania that was popular at the time as a result of Napoleon bringing stuff back from Egypt and all this research into Egypt, and that they thought that the hieroglyphics were magic because they couldn't read them yet because they hadn't found the Rosetta Stone. And so everything was Egyptian and everything Egyptian was cool. But that didn't really start in the 18th and 19th century. People always kind of thought Egypt was cool and Egypt was magical. And that's where they had the secret meeting. The secret meeting was in Thebes in Egypt. And so it was the Sworn Book of Honorius of Thebes, or the Book of Thoth, or Tehute, that became the ways that the secrets were contained. And so it was specifically supposed to be the secret mysteries as they were taught in Egypt, which of course were the mysteries over the whole world. But it wasn't just 18th and 19th century thinkers that thought this. Uh, People always thought Egypt was either a source for or a center of magical teaching. In fact, in Kiddushin 49 from the Babylonian Talmud, it says 10 measures of magic were given to the world. Egypt received 9, while the rest received 1. So all of the world got to divide up 1/10 of magic, but Egypt got 9/10. Um, and so like that, we're going back almost 1,000 years before the tarot, about 1,000 years before the tarot, and that was an idea that, or 1,000 years before people decided tarot was magic, and people were already saying that about Egypt. Um, Egypt and documents from Egypt did preserve a lot of ancient magic. There are some really great research things going on where they are translating the Greco-Egyptian magical fragments and the Coptic papyri uh, that contain basically 1,500 years of spells and magical teachings, going back from conservatively around the turn from BCE to the Common Era, possibly as far back as about 500 years BCE, but going up to about the end of the first millennium of the Common Era, if we're including the Coptic materials. And so Egypt, huge source for magical material before we start getting to the Arabic preservation and the Byzantine preservation of magic after the end of the first millennium, and then the development of magical texts in Europe starting around the 13th century. Uh, Egypt and Eastern concepts were also heavy influences on esoteric philosophy, magic, and mystery tradition amongst the Greeks and Romans. Um, the Romans had an Isis cult. Didn't necessarily really connect to anything that they actually were doing in Egypt or ISIS in Egypt, but they thought they had ISIS. Similar to Roman Mithras, didn't really connect to Persian Mithras, but they thought it was Mithras. But pulling things from Eastern cultures that they thought were more esoteric and more magical, or from Egypt, which they thought was more esoteric and more magical, that was a pretty standard practice amongst Greeks and Romans. So we can't fully blame the 18th and 19th century people for having this like Egypt was special, Egypt was magical view, because people had had that view for like 3,000 years. And Egypt kind of promoted that view. Like Egypt was like, we're so cool. The world gets destroyed every couple hundred years, but we survive because we're better. And so, and I mean, they had a culture that lasted for millennia, like one of the longest lasting cultures on Earth. Um, if we're considering lost Egyptian secrets uh, that were protected from the rise of Christianity also thought Egypt was cool early on. Jesus went and hid in Egypt as a toddler and lived his first several years in Egypt. And in some esoteric versions of Christianity, he was taught the same mysteries that Moses was taught, and he was taught all the magic that Moses learned in Egypt, and that's when he came back and impressed people in the temple. One of the earliest systems of Christianity to develop was Coptic Christianity in Egypt. Um, the in the Middle Ages, there was also a belief that Egypt and the Near East were places that had special magical learning. Christian Rosenkreutz, the mythical progenitor of the Rosicrucian Society, went to the mythical city of Damkar, which is just a random place in the East, and learned the mysteries there. But Egypt was also believed to be the source of the Kabbalah, which very early on was linked to the tarot. Egypt is not the source of the Kabbalah, and it's really offensive for people to still say that.
What?
Kabbalah, the Kabbalah.
Oh, Kabbalah.
Yeah,
Okay.
sorry. And but a lot of people claimed for a long time that it was that Kabbalah was preserving the mysteries of Egypt. And even now, in kind of New Age communities, the Merkabah stones, or the Merkabah vehicle of light. People claim that that's an Egyptian thing and that the word is a combination of Egyptian words. Merkava is the Hebrew word for chariot or throne and describes the earliest Hebrew mystical system of ascending to see the heavens and the throne of God. So that erasure of Jewish mysticism and trying to call it Egyptian is something that has existed for centuries and still exists now. And so it's something that we should be careful about. But the Egyptian connection to the tarot leads to another misconception that also kind of ties into the idea that Egypt was something that was always seen as important and mystical. Romani, when they were first traveling through Europe, claimed to be Egyptian pilgrims because Egyptians were considered people who were very holy and very tied to the mystical and the religious, and there were old forms of Christianity in Egypt. So if these traveling people were pilgrims from Egypt, then even if they were different and did things differently, they still must be Christians. And so maybe they shouldn't be treated as badly as they would be if they were complete outsiders. And so it was a way of protecting themselves from otherwise hostile European communities, and that's where the word gypsy comes from, is the claim that they were Egyptian. Distinct from that claim, later on, people who were deciding that the tarot was an ancient mystical Egyptian relic claimed that the Romani were the protectors of the tarot who brought it to Europe when they came from Egypt, and that they were the ones who were the secret holders of its mysteries. Now you even have people on TikTok going around saying that tarot is a closed Romani practice and everyone should stop doing tarot because they're stealing Romani traditions. And then you get Romani people going on TikTok being like, please stop saying this. This has nothing to do with us, and these people are not us. Because it's basically just reasserting other things that were weird stereotypes and misapprehensions that existed in the past. But it's kind of weird and interesting how all these things end up tying back together. How there's always been this assumption that Egypt was like this magical place, and then okay, these tarot cards have got to be magical. They must come from Egypt. Oh well, this was just because people thought Egypt was cool in the 19th century. It's like no, they always thought Egypt was cool, and it ties in the fact that people always thought that because they link it back to things that people thought were cool about Egypt back in the Middle Ages that weren't true then either. Tarot actually does maybe come from Egypt, though. It's weird. So, uh, so even though like the claims about Egyptian tarot are from the 18th and 19th century and are entirely untrue, they still tie to older ideas, and there's still a reason why those people thought that, and it wasn't just Napoleon was stealing cool artifacts and that made everyone excited about Egypt. And these stories, they're not just weird stories that esoteric people told. These are ideas that were just part of culture. Like Dan Brown in his Da Vinci Code books incorporates versions of this idea in his Da Vinci Code stories as well. Now, when we get to the real history of tarot was originally just a playing card game. You'll get a lot of people in from the esoteric side of things trying to look at the history of tarot, and up until recently, I thought this too. That tarot was a divination system that got kind of watered down into playing cards. And even when like I was like, okay, I know all this like esoteric stuff that we put on the tarot isn't anything that is historical. That was like made up. But at least like the idea that the cards told a story and you could like read fortunes with that story, that's got to be old. Nope, that is also from like late 18th, early 19th century. Originally, it was just a game. And most likely, that game started somewhere around the 14th or 15th century in southwestern Europe. Now, I mentioned earlier that there are some good sources for tarot history. Helen Farley wrote A Cultural History of Tarot from Entertainment to Esotericism. And it's amazing because Farley starts off by talking about how you can't look at tarot history from one discipline. You can't look at it just from the discipline of history. You can't look at it just from an esoteric studies discipline. You can't look at it just from a discipline of art history. But art history has to be there because it is art, and that will inform how we understand how those pictures developed. We also have to look at it within cultural context and looking at cultural history. So you've got to bring all these things to the table, which is probably part of why there's not a lot of good academic material on it, because it has to be an interdisciplinary study in order to really dig into it. But Farley does. And so if you really want to dig into this history in detail, Farley is the book to go to. Now, Farley's prevailing thesis is about cultural context and how you have to look at the cultural context to understand how the cards developed, why they developed, and why the different ways of viewing the cards developed as they did. And part of that, if you really think about it, is kind of obvious. The cards were developed by nobles in Europe around the 14th or 15th century. Our lives have nothing to do with what their lives were like. And even if you go back to the 18th or 19th century, the stuff that was going on for the Sforzas in Renaissance Italy or early modern Italy would have been completely foreign to a bunch of French guys at the end of the 18th century. And so they're going to look at these cards and be like, what the heck are these pictures? What are they designing? Oh, this has to have some weird, mysterious secret. There has to be some deep hidden meaning, and we can probe and figure out what that hidden meaning is. And that is probably why people came to the conclusion that the cards had these esoteric mysteries attached to them, because they looked at them and it's like, okay, there's got to be some system to why these pictures are designed the way they are and why they're in this pack and why they're arranged in this order. But what is it? And if you were a noble in the early modern period in Italy or France, it would be pretty obvious because it connected to things that you might encounter in life or ideas that you would deal with in life and that you would navigate. But people later on, it's not going to mean those things, and those things aren't going to be immediately obvious. Likewise, as we move past those early decks, if we look back at a deck from the beginning of the 19th century, a lot of the ideas and symbols that they built into those decks won't make immediate sense for us. We'll have their writings about them, and so we can go back and we can figure out what they were, and then we can apply those ideas to our lives. But that's also the impetus behind people creating more modern decks, is that they can work in symbols, they can work in ideas, they can work in themes and aesthetics that make more sense for the contemporary consumer. And so they're building off the idea that there's these esoteric ideas that have to be built into it, but some of the esoteric ideas change with the modern decks. And so the symbols change and the images change because what they're trying to interpret and represent has changed as well. And so when we start looking at tarot within those contexts, we can start to understand why cards were designed the way they were and why they had the meanings that they had at different points in time. And then that can inform how we approach things that are being created now and understand how they relate to our particular context. And we can also think about the fact that we don't all have the same context. And that's why there's so many different decks that speak to so many different people. One person might hate a deck and love another deck, and their neighbor might hate the opposite deck and love the opposite deck because their contexts are going to be a little bit different. So the tarot cards most likely developed from the standard set of 52 playing cards. Again, there's the popular assumption that tarot developed first and then the playing cards were a simplified version of that. More likely, the 52 playing cards developed or were imported into Europe and adjusted for Europeans. And then the tarot cards were an expansion off of that were made for wealthy people initially, because they had to be painted, and then eventually they were printed for more mass market consumption. But by the time that was first happening, their popularity was starting to dwindle, and it was only certain places where you tended to find them. Various countries use systems of playing card suits slightly varied from hearts, clubs, diamonds, and spades. And so the idea that you've got batons, coins, swords, and cups isn't that weird when you start looking at the fact that I think like Germany has acorns on theirs, um, but like different places in the world, they all have four suits. The four suits do the same thing, but what they call the suits and how they decorate the suits differs. And so the tarot suits were just a different way of doing that, and they match the old Italian playing card suits. So they're not different from the way the suits were done in Italy early on. The idea that they were originally the four elemental weapons and then got turned into the playing card suits is really easy to knock down because the four elemental weapons were invented by Eliphas Levi in the 18th century. Levi, yeah, I think 18th century. So they couldn't have been the basis of tarot cards 3 centuries earlier, because that wasn't a concept in magic at the time. The earliest evidence of European playing cards predates the earliest evidence of tarot by about 50 years. So we can also see that playing cards existed in terms of physical remains and writing about cards. We see the playing cards were there first. A lot of the evidence is based on prohibition against card games. So the idea that tarot was a safe alternative, or that playing card games were a safe alternative to tarot, and you could hide the tarot in these playing card games, falls apart when your local magistrates and religious leaders and governors were writing about how they didn't want these playing card games in their communities because playing card games were not a safe, acceptable thing. They were another thing that were thought of as being bad. An Italian reference in 1480 suggests that playing cards were introduced by Arabs. There's also a Spanish reference to Moorish playing cards in 1460 and a French reference to Arabic playing cards in 1406. So at least the perception at the time that they started was that they were being brought in either from somewhere in North Africa or somewhere in the Near East, most likely North Africa. Yeah, that's where we're gonna get to that as far as where they ultimately come from.
And why were they considered bad?
Because they were associated with gambling.
Okay.
So, a 15th century Egyptian deck was discovered in the 1930s with most of the cards intact and the suits matching the later Italian suits. So, still goes back to Egypt, even if the people who were saying it went back to Egypt were just making it up. They got lucky. So there's evidence of Egyptian playing cards going back to the 12th century, which, as you mentioned, the Mamluks. And Farley actually digs deep into this, talking about how the four suits were originally based on implements related to particular offices in the Sultan's royal court. And this matches other iconographic practices at the time. So within this culture that was there in 12th century Egypt, the cards could be matched up to other things that happen in the culture. We see cards from that region early on. There's also some other lone evidence of earlier cards. So it does seem that that's about where they developed and where they come from. Well, there are a bunch of theories about Chinese and further Eastern origins for them. It does seem like the Egyptian origin is probably the most. It's the one that's got the clearest evidence for a path for the cards to come into Europe. But the cards games that existed in the further east, some of their structure was different. There was also an Indian card game that had more suits, and the suits don't match up with what was used in Egypt and then what was later used in Europe. Um, but there's no path by which those cards, where we have any evidence of those cards being transmitted either to Egypt or into Europe. The same with the cards in China. There's no path that shows that they were ever transmitted to Egypt or to Europe, and the gameplay was different for those. And so we don't have anything that shows how the gameplay and style of cards would have morphed into what we find there. So there's a pretty clear link to the 12th century Egyptian game with the European game, and then a pretty clear link between European playing cards and the tarot. But there is a possibility that the other card games in India and China and throughout the East may have had an influence also. It's just we can't prove that influence or demonstrate how one became the other or how one eventually traveled from one place to the other place. Yes, so they and that's one of the pieces of evidence that people use for them being the earliest form. Also, one of the pieces of evidence that it could not be an ancient Egyptian encapsulation of ancient mysteries because Egypt didn't have paper or cardstock. So and there's no physical evidence of anything surviving prior to that 12th century survival. So if the Chinese game is the ultimate origin, then I think that puts it at like the 9th century. Um, but again, there's evidence that we know that they had playing cards earlier, both between the fact that they had paper earlier, the fact that we have earlier physical evidence and written references to their card games. But they just haven't historians haven't been able to track either a material path or a path of ideas for how the one game would have become the other game in the other place. So they could have informed the games that came further west, or the games from further west could have spontaneously developed separately. But that's where we get to that murkiness, where there's a couple possibilities in the history, but we can't say for certain definitively what the earliest parts of it are. We can say pretty solidly that the 12th century Egyptian cards influenced the cards in the early 15th century in Europe, and that the Egyptian cards had the same suits that the Italian cards had, and then the Italian card suits spread out to the various other suits that developed in Europe, and that they match up with the suits in the minor cards in the tarot. Um, it's also in Italy where we see the first trump cards develop and the first trump games develop. So it's clear that that's where the tarot developed. And so the earliest tarot that we know of is from around the mid 15th century in Italy, the Visconti di Madrone, which we don't have a complete deck that survives, but there's I guess a handful of examples, and so there are reconstructed decks. Which today, if you buy a Visconti Sforza deck, then that is a reconstruction of what they believe the early Visconti di Madrone tarot was. Um, the Marseille tarot then developed in France after France conquered Milan in 1499. So we can see a direct transfer from Italy into France for the tarot. And then later decks, particularly those. Okay, my note there isn't great. There were some variations in decks in different parts of Europe. So there were other trump games inspired by the tarot that used a slightly different structure than the style that was popular in France and was based on the Italian structure. But that became the predominant structure in most parts of Europe, and over time has now become the surviving structure to influence most tarot. The earliest surviving Marseille cards were made by Philippe Vachier in 1639 or Nicolas Rochon in 1637. There's some debate about that based on the dates on the printing and trying to identify who those people were as far as which deck was actually earlier. And some of the decks labeled with different creators in France at the time were clearly made using the same plates, and so, like, one printer would buy the plates from another Cartier who would have gone out of business, and then they would begin printing decks with those plates, but they might remove the other guy's name and put their name on it, or they might remove the date that the other guy had commissioned the plates and put their name on their date on the plates. So there's a lot of similarity because they were starting to be a reproducible form of art at that point. Like we talk about art in the age of reproduction as like a late 19th century, early 20th century thing, but we had forms of it going back at least to the 17th century. There were several other artists and printers that manufactured decks. The Jean Noblet deck from the 17th century is one that a lot of people are familiar with, and Nicholas Conver's deck from 1760 is the one that developed and influenced the occult decks that came shortly thereafter. And so a lot of your contemporary Marseille decks are based on Conver, or some I think there are Vachier, Rollachon, and Noblet decks that you can get at this point as well, like reproductions of those. But Conver was probably the one who influenced people like Antoine Court de Gebelin, who is the architect of all the Egyptian craziness with the tarot. So he was a Freemason, Protestant clergyman. He might have been a Martinist. Lots of people were Martinists at that point because it was sort of new and cool. And he was the guy that originated the idea that the tarot was the lost book of Thoth. He was involved in a lot of different parts of French esotericism, and he wrote a 9-volume work called The Ancient World Analyzed and Compared with the Modern World, and he devoted the 8th volume partially to the tarot. Apparently, he was out one day, and he saw a group of women playing tarot. And it was something that he had seen the game as a child, hadn't seen it played for a long time, and it suddenly struck him that these cards were the remnants of the lost Egyptian book of Thoth. So going back to that myth that some adepts encoded the secrets of Egypt in this secret book. He decided that the various trump cards revealed different ideas in the Egyptian mysteries, and the way that, at least through the lens that French occultists at the time interpreted Hermeticism. He guessed that the gypsies had brought these cards to Europe, and that these cards had been entrusted to them by Egyptian priests millennia ago. It's a pretty big leap from seeing some women play a card game to decide all this. Yes.
Do you have an opinion on the line of thought that says while things weren't explicitly put in the Visconti scores, there was a lot of Neoplatonic thought kind of in the artist crowd at the time, and sometimes symbols tend to just look at that.
I mean, that's very possible, and I know there was the Game of Saturn, which I don't think was about the Sforza deck. I think it was about another early Italian deck that was fairly different from what became standard tarot. But the theory in that book was that it was both describing sort of the political machinations of the time, but also a secret paganism that existed in the Italian nobility, which my understanding is that there's a very good case made for it in the book, but it would be really hard for us to prove that there was a secret Italian paganism in the Italian nobility in the 15th century.
Based on her medicine. They had just found and Medici had it translated in the
Yes.
1400s.
So
They were basing it on the Greek Hermeticism that had come up through.
yeah, the Hermeticism and Neoplatonism would be much more likely influences than like a secret pagan cult that the aristocrats were part of. The part of the problem with the association of tarot and Hermeticism, though, is that a lot of the things that de Gebelin claimed were Hermetic in the tarot were not actual Hermetic symbols or Hermetic ideas. And they were things that were part of the esoteric thinking in France at the time, but they weren't necessarily the esoteric thinking of the Italian nobility who were rediscovering Hermetic texts and rediscovering Neoplatonic texts, and also looking at Arabic grimoires along with Spanish nobility who'd been doing it a couple hundred years before that. It was reflecting more ideas that were kind of part of the new Gnosticism and new French occultism that was developing at the time. De Gebelin declared that this had been the best way for them to hide their secrets, was to code them into a game and preserve them until an adept would recognize them. And obviously, De Gebelin was that adept that everyone had waited millennia for. He asserted that the trumps equated to the 22 letters of the Egyptian alphabet, and that the Hebrew alphabet was based on this 22-letter Egyptian alphabet that did not exist. There was no 22-letter Egyptian alphabet. So we can kind of toss out most of what de Gebelin thought because he didn't provide any evidence. He just kind of speculated, which was the standard at the time. This is not something where we need to be like, oh, this de Gebelin guy was bonkers, or like he was doing something awful. This was normal for up until like probably the mid 20th century. That was very typical that you'd have historical writing where people just thought about what they figured made sense and wrote it down as if it was fact, or thought about what they wanted it to be and wrote it down as if it was fact. And sometimes they were pulling on things that were sort of the folk history of the time that was built partially from biblical narrative, built partially from other folklore and mythology, and from incomplete historical sources, but a lot of times had a lot of jumps to fill in a lot of gaps. As we noted, Egyptians didn't have materials to make a card game at the time that they would have been preserving these mysteries. Again, the Egyptians did have Hermeticism. There's some theory that Greek Hermetic thought came from Egypt. There's some theory that Hermetic thought developed in Greece or Rome and then was imported back into Egypt and took on Egyptian traits. There's some competing ideas around that depending on which sources you're looking at. That's the claim, but a lot of the early Hermetic writings, we don't have Egyptian survivals of them. We have Greek survivals of them, and the particular Greek. Right, and so that's where the debate is whether there was an earlier form of the teaching that came into it, or if it was a combination of Platonism and Gnosticism that developed into a new system somewhere within the empire, whether it was in Greece or Rome or Egypt, but drew from Egyptian symbolism because, again, throughout the Mediterranean, Egypt was thought of as the source for a lot of those things. But we also had. It had. Yeah, that wasn't the only or the most important library in the ancient world at the time, despite modern popular opinion on that. But Egypt also had been under Greek rule for about 400 years before we have any sort of Hermetic text. And the Greek ruler of it was, the original Greek ruler was like a second generation student of Plato. So the idea that Platonism had moved into Egypt and may have developed Hermeticism and been re-imported back into Greece and Rome is very possible. It's also possible that there was an ongoing exchange of ideas and materials and people between Egypt and the Italian peninsula and the Greek city-states, and so they could have developed at any place along there. We can't say for certain without having an earlier historical text or an earlier surviving document or something showing Hermetic ideas existing in Egypt, written in Egyptian prior to the development of Greek Hermetic ideas. So that's why I'm saying that there's competing theories on how they developed. It's not something where there's clear-cut material evidence that shows that it was definitely developed in Egypt, moved to Greece, or developed in Greece, moved to Egypt. There was a constant interplay of influences because these cultures were kind of constantly overlapping for about a 400 to 500 year period leading into the development of Hermeticism. But as far as the tarot goes, the ideas that de Gebelin was assigning to the tarot didn't match with ideas of Hermeticism, regardless of where Hermeticism initially developed. Um, there's also no cards that survive from antiquity, and the imagery that developed into the tarot doesn't match back to either what we know of Egyptian mysteries or styles of artwork from Egypt or Egyptian culture. So there's no reason to think that they were inspired by that specifically. The next person along the lines of developing this was Atella, which was a pseudonym for Jean-Baptiste Aliette. It was just his last name backwards. And he developed a system of cartomancy in 1750. So he was actually a little earlier than de Gebelin as far as cartomancy goes. But his original cartomancy system was using Tarocco Bolognese, which had 35 cards. So, oh wait, no. His system, he claimed, I'm sorry, I misread my note there. He claimed that he developed the first system of cartomancy. There was a 1750 system of cartomancy that used the Tarocco Bolognese. Atella's first system was 1770 and used a standard playing card deck. And he published it in Ways to Entertain Oneself with a pack of cards. He used a smaller version of the playing card deck rather than develop a system for the full 52 cards. After de Gebelin released his ideas about the tarot, Atella was like, well, I already put out cartomancy and talked about meanings for cards. So clearly I knew about this before de Gebelin did. And so he released a new book, Way to Entertain Oneself with a Pack of Tarot Cards, in 1783. And wrote a handful of texts based on that. Did you?
The original was that the one that eventually developed on?
I don't know for certain the link there. Like I know there was definitely influence with Lenormand and what was going on at the time, but I haven't dived into that specifically. So Atella claimed that the tarot was created by 17 magi under the direction of Hermes Trismegistus 171 years before the flood, which he claimed was the 22nd century BCE. He linked the tarot cards to astrology, the elements, and the four humors. He wasn't the first person to create those sorts of links, though. The Minciate, which is a Florentine variant of the tarot from the 16th century that had 97 cards, added cards to the trumps in order to have cards to represent the elements and the zodiac. But they weren't the same as the traditional cards that inspired de Gebelin and Atella. Atella also linked them to the 7 days of creation and the major forces and events of life. He claimed that the modern deck makers had corrupted the designs, and he wrote out descriptions for what they originally were. In 1788, he formed the Society for the Interpretation of the Book of Thoth, and he eventually published his own tarot deck based on what he believed the designs were supposed to be. Now, for people who get into the Atella Tarot, there's different groupings and then subgroupings for Atella styles, because there were also variants of it that were published by his students. I know Benabel Wen has written significantly about that, and I think has been working on a reconstructed Atella deck. So if you're interested in Atella and his decks, look into Benabel Wen's work.
The first 7 cards on creation.
Yes.
After Commander, the Hermetic.
And so he his system, it's one where you can actually look up what he assigned to the cards. Like his books are available, the images are available. You could go reconstruct his system of working with the cards, and but it's not quite the system that informed the decks that most people are used to today. Eliphas Levi is one of the next important steps. Not the only intervening step, but one of the next important ones. He was one of several French occultists to explore the tarot and talk about Egyptian mysteries related to the tarot in the 19th century. He created the idea of the four elemental weapons, and those influenced the Golden Dawn and later occultism. Worth was another person who worked on new designs for the tarot, and he specifically was influenced by Levy and was directed to make a deck that followed Levy's descriptions. And so he designed a Marseille-style deck that followed the changes that Levy described. The people say that Levy was probably influenced by Attila, even though he rejected Attila's deck, and his description for the deck was still what the deck should be, was based on the Marseille Tarot. But Levy didn't like cartomancy. He felt that the tarot communicated the secrets of the universe, and that it was a book through which symbolism expressed the doctrines of the occult. He focused on correspondences and relating the tarot to the Hebrew letters. And so de Gebelin had kind of referred to the Hebrew letters and his imaginary Egyptian letters, but Leve actually assigned them and was one of the first people to assign them. He also thought that that was such an important structure that his 2-volume Dogma and Ritual of High Magic, each volume has 22 chapters. He was the first person to sort of fully intertwine Kabbalah and tarot. Let's see. He believed that the magician not only corresponded to the letter Aleph, but that the magician was intended to be in the shape of the letter Aleph. And so in Worth's deck, you see that, and you see that influence later on in Waite as well. Levy's Kabbalah was primarily based on Christian mystics, specifically Kircher. And Kircher created a scheme of Kabbalah correspondence that was used in Christianity and influenced the Hermetic Kabbalah, and was also claiming that it was all Egyptian ultimately. Kircher's Kabbalah apparently did not really draw a lot on actual Jewish Kabbalah, and so unfortunately, the last conference where I taught this, one of the presenters that's here this weekend, Sarah Mastros, she was teaching some classes on Jewish Kabbalah at that conference, and so I was able to recommend people go to that. She's teaching different things at this conference. But a lot of times people will sort of talk about differences between Hermetic Kabbalah and Jewish Kabbalah, but when you look at kind of the development of it, the Christian Kabbalah kind of ditched most elements of Jewish Kabbalah right out of the gate and just focused on building systems of correspondences and had some kind of loose philosophy around those systems of correspondences. And that ultimately is kind of what developed into the bulk of what Hermetic Kabbalah is. So they are very distinct systems. Levy redescribed the cards to suit his needs, and he was the first person to assign elemental correspondences to the suits of the minor arcana, and sort of developed the basic schema that influenced later occult tarots. As we said, Oswald Worth designed a tarot based on Levy's writings under the instruction of Stanislas de Goethe, and he focused on making it look like Tarot de Marseille. So sometimes you'll see cards that look like Marseille cards, but they have relatively modern symbolism, and those are the Worth cards. And so it's like you'll kind of look at them and be like, wait, isn't this Marseille Tarot? Why does it have the modern occult symbolism that the Marseille Tarot doesn't? Well, it's because they were created in 1889, and which was 14 years after the death of Levy. but 1 year before the founding of the Golden Dawn. And then the Golden Dawn is really where it all gets going into the modern world of tarot. Because ultimately, modern magic, neo-paganism, all of that owes a great deal to the Golden Dawn. And I say that as somebody who really prefers to work with more traditional modalities before the Golden Dawn, but I still recognize that the whole movement that created everything modern wouldn't have happened without them. So Mathers and Westcott each wrote books about tarot prior to developing the Golden Dawn, where they focused on drawing from Levi, Itella, and de Gebelin. Mathers wrote the first UK published book on tarot in 1888, The Tarot and Its Occult Signification, Use in Fortune Telling, and Method of Play. 3 of the initial Golden Dawn grades incorporated tarot knowledge, and the Golden Dawn was the first to align the tarot to the Tree of Life directly using the Hebrew letters. The Golden Dawn correspondences don't match up with what Mathers and Westcott originally wrote about, though. They use a different structure from Levy and from the earlier authors. And they follow the scheme that's described in the cipher manuscript, which was the basis of the Golden Dawn's teachings and rituals. Now, there are some people who think that Mathers and Westcott probably made the cipher manuscript up themselves, but this is a good piece of evidence that they might not have, or probably didn't, because originally they followed Levy in terms of how they interpreted the tarot and its occult significance. But after getting the cipher manuscript, they completely changed how they were approaching it in order to follow what the cipher manuscript said. It would be unlikely that they would write a manuscript that differed from their own ideas. In the Golden Dawn system, cards could be used for divination or for understanding secret correspondences. And so they kind of had both things going. They had sort of the Itella thing going, and they had the de Gebelin thing going there. But the Golden Dawn also felt that the cards could be used for practical magic. And that was something that hadn't really been incorporated into the earlier interpretations of it. The Golden Dawn standardized names and numberings, and that became the basis for the standard names and numberings in most modern decks. Their divinatory meanings were based on Kabbalistic correspondences. So, like, when people read Tarot de Marseille, they're generally reading the pictures and not necessarily esoteric symbols. De Gebelin had his own series of meanings and ideas that he developed symbols to reflect, and so did Itella. And Levi started trying to make it more Kabbalistic, but the Golden Dawn actually created a system of meanings that were standard, that were based on their Kabbalistic correspondences. They renamed batons to wands and coins to pentacles in order to match the elemental weapons, and they corresponded the Sephiroth to the numbered cards, and that was something that hadn't been done before. Mathers also created a set of cards for the Golden Dawn using symbolism drawing from multiple different cultures and mythologies and symbolisms systems to reflect the meanings and correspondences espoused by the Golden Dawn. Coming out of the Golden Dawn was the ever-boring writer, A.E. Waite. He is a great example of what writing at that time was like. Waite was a Catholic, but he was a Golden Dawn member, but he didn't like it. And his wife liked it even less. She also joined the Golden Dawn, but never went to anything aside from her own initiation. He felt that it would be better to have an order that did what the Golden Dawn did, but only focused on mysticism and no magic. So today you get a lot of people who, they kind of like look at the Golden Dawn as the beginning of this conflation of magic and mysticism, where magic is just about spiritual development or coming closer to God or enlightening yourself. Magic historically was mostly about getting shit done and going out and making things happen. Mysticism was more self-development and coming into connection with God. You have around the time of like the Martinists, you start seeing a connection between those two things. And there's a few other systems that develop in kind of the 18th century on that interweave those things more. the Golden Dawn definitely took the two hand in hand and built a system where the mysticism helped develop you to be able to do magic. But most of the magic was in the second order, which most people didn't get to. And so what survives from the Golden Dawn is kind of this focus on mysticism, which with Crowley and Rigardi and Fortune largely became a focus on psychology and sort of psychologized mysticism. But the Golden Dawn had a lot of actual magic stuff in it. It was just not what was in the beginning grades. And Waite didn't like that. He didn't want the magic. He just wanted the mysticism. And so that's actually a great example of the fact that both things existed as kind of separate but interwoven things in the Golden Dawn system, as opposed to being fully compressed into one thing in the Golden Dawn system. After Crowley published the Golden Dawn teachings on tarot, Waite felt that it was okay for him to do a publication on it because he wasn't the first one breaking the secrecy rules at that point. And so he made his own publication, and in 1909 he released his tarot with Pamela Coleman Smith as the artist. Now, a lot of people like to malign Waite because, I mean, he was a really boring, bad writer who misunderstood a lot of the stuff he was writing about. So there's some room to malign Waite. Crowley liked to malign Waite because he thought Waite was a stick in the mud. But today, a lot of people like to malign Waite because they think that he erased Pamela Coleman Smith and that he took credit for this deck, but she was the one that actually created it. Most of those people have never worked with a graphic designer, where you tell them, I need a design that looks like this, I need it to have this elements, these are the color scheme for our branding, so that needs to be the color scheme that's built into it. Our previous designer used these fonts and our style guide has these fonts, so we need these fonts to be incorporated in it. Build something with that. And so you get the new McDonald's logo, and everyone loves the new McDonald's logo, and no one knows who the graphic designer is who made it. And that graphic designer was working with a lot of instruction and being told what to do. It was not free-form art. Similar case when you've got something like this. Now, with Crowley's 12th Tarot, Lady Frida Harris probably took the reins on a lot of what was going on in that tarot deck.
And some of their correspondence is really argumentative, where she's like, I hate this color, I don't want to.
Yeah. There's a lot of evidence that she brought a lot to the table and designed a lot of what was happening, and she probably needs equal billing to Crowley on that. With Pamela Coleman Smith, she definitely deserves recognition for being the artist, but Waite would have been telling her, these are the colors to use, these are the symbols to use, this is what happens, what is on this card and what should be depicted in this card, and this is what I want it to look like. So the fact that it was published as Waite's deck is really not the travesty that modern people try to make it out to. It's just kind of what happens when you hire an artist for things, especially at a time where no one was credited for anything. I mean, Crowley just took books that Mathers wrote and published them as his own, and then DeLawrence took Crowley's publications of Mathers books and published them as his own books. That was just the norm back then because there weren't copyright laws.
Oh, I was just going to say, we still see it even now in modern times with tarot. I mean, when I was first getting into witchcraft and paganism, you would pick up a deck, and a lot of them would just have the author's name on the deck.
Mm-hmm.
And, like, maybe inside the booklet it would say, like, who the artist was of the deck.
Yeah.
But, like, that still happens. So I guess, in my mind, I never really understood why people are so up in uproar about the Pamela Coleman Smith thing, when, like, we still do that to artists.
Yeah.
Even nowadays with tarot decks.
And yeah, because it's the norm. Basically, she should have an illustrator credit.
Yeah.
And they just didn't have those.
Yeah.
But it is nice that she's recognized now for it because it's such an influential deck, and her artwork has influenced and inspired the way other people interpret those things in other decks later on. But the idea that it's intentional erasure is kind of misunderstanding what was happening. Yes.
Yeah, and it's my understanding that a lot of the Kabbalistic stuff that she brought in, because she, and the story I've heard is that she was Jewish, or she was raised in a Jewish household.
There are a lot of different backgrounds and stories claimed about her and who she was, and it's really hard to pin down what's actually accurate.
Mhm.
So, yeah. And even in her life, she cultivated the idea that, like, she was kind of this mysterious person from mysterious places who had mysterious connections, and there seems to be evidence that she probably told a lot of different backstories for herself as well. Which, I mean, as a woman trying to gain power as an artist at that time and gaining work, that was a brilliant strategy. That made sense as a thing to do, especially if she was going to be working with esoteric people and people in theater and people in the arts like she did. That would have been super important for that. So they published their tarot deck, and it was the first commercially published tarot deck in the UK. Waite was also the first person to add full illustrations depicting divinatory symbolism for the numbered suits. Solabusca, that was the game of Saturn deck, might have influenced Waite's use of images on the minor cards, though, because they had them too. Waite maintained much of the Golden Dawn structure and meanings, but returned to the Tarot of Marseille style for the trump cards. There's a few cards that are notable departures from that, though. So now that we've kind of got that history, it gets us to our handy little printout. I'll kind of Vanna White it there for you. One of my younger friends yesterday did not know who Vanna White was. So, what? Oh my God. So the thing that originally got me thinking about this idea of the history of tarot and how the different decks are not interchangeable, the different decks have hugely different meanings because they have different designs, was the Magician card. I mean, I guess the thing that first got me thinking about it was when I got kind of hipstery with the Marseille Tarot. But looking at the Magician card was what came from that. So when we look at the Magician, originally it was Il Bagato, which means, or Il Bagatello, which basically means the trifle. Later it became the Bethelier, which means like a street performer or a juggler or a traveler. And then it became the Magician. Oh yeah, if you get a handout. Yeah, if anyone else needs handouts, there's some extra up here for people who came in a little late. And that Magician could sometimes be a performer, like in earlier cards, or sometimes the Magician was the adept or the ascended master even in some decks, like the Thoth deck. So if we can look at these Magician cards, and I mean, if you look at them in like the early tarot decks, you've got sometimes they've got an audience, but always the things that are on the table when you look at the older decks, they're tools of prestidigitation. They're tools of sleight of hand. They're methods to trick people. They're not tools of magic. They're not tools of enlightenment. They're not tools to control the forces of creation. They're tools of distraction and of misdirection. If we flip it over, then we've got some magicians who are kind of magical. You've got the Worth Magician, where he's kind of doing his, look at me, I'm letter Aleph. And he's got some tools that look like magical tools, and he's got like a whole array of them. And he's got this kind of big, wide-brimmed hat. When we get to Waite, that wide-brimmed hat changes to an infinity symbol. Now we've got somebody who, he doesn't just have tools of magic. He's got the 4 elemental weapons. He's got a double wand of power, and he's crowned with infinity. He's got the Ouroboros as his belt. He's got the Abramelin robe as his robe. So he's the enlightened adept who has attained his holy guardian angel and has mastered the elemental forces. If we look at Crowley's tarot, personally, I think it looks kind of like a clown. I am not a fan of the Thoth tarot, despite my long time in the OTO. But it's definitely supposed to be some sort of like divine ascended figure. He's like the Magus of Light, which is like a pretty high initiation level in the OTO structure. And he's back to sort of being a juggler, but the things that he's juggling are these things that seem to be related to the elements of creation, the forces of creation, and he's got symbols that deal with the fact that he's able to move through these different realms of existence. And then we get to the Robin Wood Tarot, which is like one of the earlier sort of modern neo-pagan tarots. And we've got a guy who he's definitely pulling from these earlier magician trends. He's got his altar. He's got his elemental weapons, but now his elemental weapons, even though they're really the exact same elemental weapons, they definitely give more of a Wiccan vibe, the way the weapons are made and the way they're laid out. He's got a deer skull cap. He's got antlers. He's kind of got this priest of the horn god or antlered god thing going on. And his robe, instead of being like the Abramelin initiate, he's kind of got like Santa robes going. Like he's the like a modern figure who could maybe be tied to what people think might be some ancient pagan symbolism, but there's actually no history supporting that. And instead of having pillars behind him, he's still got kind of the black and white pillars referencing the Kabbalah, but now they're candles, which is the standard way that structure of a Golden Dawn ritual transferred itself into neo-pagan ritual. And he's still got the infinity, but now he's holding on to it. He's not crowned by it anymore. It's something that he's able to exchange and interact with, as opposed to what's crowning him. So when you kind of dig into how these things change and how they're different, there's no way you can read these cards as the same card. Like, they mean completely different things. The traditional cards mean a guy who's going to trick you on the street. He's going to distract you from what you're doing. He might take your money. Or he might be a diversion from other problems that are happening in life. He might be entertainment. The guys in the modern cards, they're all getting down with some spiritual stuff. They're doing some things. But what they're doing is kind of different. But they're all still kind of related to each other. But the angle on it and the meaning of it is something that's different. And so that's kind of where we have to look at that context and how we have to look at what the deck is actually saying. What is the symbolism of that deck? What is the meaning of the deck? Because if you learned reading the Waite Tarot and you're used to reading that, and then you pull out the Thoth Tarot, the trumps aren't even the same in the Thoth Tarot. They mean different things. The symbols are different for the ones that are the same. So you're not going to be able to read that and get the same things from the cards, or at least the deck's not trying to tell you the same things. Like, you could lay out the cards, you could say, like, okay, I know this trump is the same as this trump that I recognize from the Waite deck, and so I'm going to read it the same way. But you're not really having a tool that works with you at that point, or a tool that works with what you're doing, or why you're using it. And then the Robin Wood Tarot is going to give you a completely different flavor from that. It's got different focuses and different ideas, and what it means to be a magician in that card is different from what it means to be a magician in the other three, and definitely different from what it means in the older cards. So it doesn't mean that necessarily one deck is better than another deck. It means one deck's going to speak to your needs better than another deck would. But you might not have only one need, because you're not a flat piece of paper. You're not even a two-sided piece of paper. You are a multifaceted diamond that shines like a star. And so there's lots of different rays and directions reflecting off of you, and those things might have different things that they need. So when you're looking at decks, you might say, okay, I need a deck that is going to be for fortune telling and divination. Any of those old decks are going to be great for that. You might be able to use Weight or Worth for that too. But the Crowley deck's probably not going to be great for that. And decks like Robin Wood and later more modern decks might not be as good for that, because they're focused on different things. Maybe you want a deck that's for more spiritual reflection or more higher-minded divination. Weight and Worth could work for that, but you might not get that out of the older decks. A lot of your modern tarot decks and oracle decks will be good for that. If you want one that's focused on mysticism and magic, Crowley. That is what his deck is for. And he lays out all the details on the cards and in a long book for how he intended for them to be meant. And as was mentioned, you can even find correspondence on how the deck was developed. There are museum shows for the deck. There's all kinds of things. You can look at everything that goes into what that deck is. You could use some of the modern decks or oracle decks for that too. But again, the historical decks, probably not great for that unless you're trying to like do something weird with it. But on the magic end, if your magic is more folk magic, more sorcery, regular playing card deck might be great for that. And you might be able to pull some stuff with some of the older decks that tie in to more real life sorcery things using those as well. So the decks aren't necessarily only going to be for one thing or another, but there's going to be things that they have strengths for and weaknesses for. And you've got to kind of figure that out, looking at the deck, looking at the style of the deck, the context of the deck. But then even how you read the deck might be different. If you're looking at the traditional tarot cards, you're going to read the deck like a story. You're going to lay out the images, and the images might look at each other based on what direction they're facing. And that tells you something about how the images relate, because this card is one part of the story, this card is the next part, this card is the next part. This card might be one person in the story, this might be the next person, this might be the next person. And so you're going to look at how the card pictures interplay with each other, or there are cartomancy meanings that are also tied to playing card decks that have been assigned to the minor arcana cards in the traditional decks. And so you might have those where they talk about different themes and events if you have a minor arcana card in there, and that kind of gets into the details of the story at that point. But you're telling a story and reading a story. It's a storybook when you're working with those styles of cards. If you like reading symbolism and analyzing symbolism, and you like pretty pictures, Weight or Worth are great for that. If I'm reading Marseille, I'm doing the storybook reading. If I'm reading Weight, I'm reading Hermetic Kabbalah symbols and how it relates to the Tree of Life and how the symbols on the card play out related to that. I still bring some of the story element to it because the pictures kind of work for that in Waite's deck. They don't necessarily work for that in some other decks. If you're wanting something where it's mostly feelings, there's a lot of great modern decks that are based on being reflective, based on being emotional, based on tying to feelings and illustrating those feelings as they relate to these themes in the tarot. You might be able to use Crowley's deck for that as well. If your focus is on correspondences and really esoteric interpretations through those correspondences, looking at how these astrological signs relate to the cards and how the elements relate to the cards, then you can get some of that with Weight and Worth, but there's a lot of that in Crowley. So the reading style, as well as what you're going to use it for, can vary a lot based on which deck you're looking at. And personally, I think looking at how those decks developed and how these ideas developed and led to those decks, and then how the different styles of decks diverged off from there, can give us a lot of guidance in how we approach exploring that and determining which decks are going to be suited for which purposes and which reading styles. And that really is ultimately the goal, is finding the thing that's going to be the best tool for you to read the way you want to read for the purpose you want to read for. And again, even some of those styles of reading, they're going to play out better for different purposes. Like if you're trying to do high-minded mystical reflection, storytelling is maybe not the way to go. But heavy symbolism probably is. But that doesn't mean you can't make the storytelling variety work for that too. A lot of it is what you bring to the table as well. And so that is pretty much it. I think we're a couple minutes over, but not too bad on that. Were there any questions or anything like that? I know we covered a lot of stuff. I tried to keep it kind of light as we went through it, but when we start getting into like, this happened at this date and this happened at this date, it's hard to keep that light. So if you enjoyed the way I talk about things, again, there are the little cards that have a QR code that'll take you to a page from my blog that's just got links to like my YouTube page, my Amazon author page, everything that I do. You can find some way to connect to it through there. I am notoriously bad about how to answer the question of how do people find what you're doing, and so cards. And I've got a handful of books that I've written. There's one that's sort of general kind of animist look at magic. Goes through the history of conjuration, history of grimoires, but then also talks about American conjure work and how to tie spirit work into that, using sort of Neoplatonic ideas for building Hermetic Kabbalah rituals for consecrating pentacles and tying spirit work into that. It takes various different systems and ties it all into spirit work. There's another one that's kind of a quick and dirty grimoire where you can probably read the book in a day And if you've never done grimoire magic, you probably got the stuff in your house that you can use for it. And within 3 days to a week, you can use the different magical preparation methods that it gives you to be conjuring angels and aerial spirits. And it's kind of modular, so you can work it for other spirits as well. And then probably my most solid book is a book on familiar spirits it's the most comprehensive book available on familiars, goes through the history, the folklore, talks about different methods for obtaining familiars, how to work with and maintain them once you have one. Also looks at Baltimore's demon that is housed over on Pulaski Street in the OTO Lodge there. We did a traditional conjuration for a demon, had it give us a familiar to serve the lodge, bound it to an animal skull using blood paint in a jar that had various magical material to support that using traditional means. And they have a shrine for it there where they make offerings to it, and it services the lodge and has been doing so for about 6 or 7 years at this point. All the rituals that were used to set that up, all the backstory on that, rituals that were used to celebrate it in sort of a witchcraft style possession Sabbat are included in that book as well. In addition to looking at modes of spirit work that were done by people in the Golden Dawn and Crowley related to familiar spirits, and a little bit of sex magic as well. So, and I've got discounts where you can get the books in bundles, much cheaper than you can get them on Amazon. So if you're interested in that, I have a handful, not a ton of them. We might have to move out into the hallway because the next class is probably coming in.
Thank you.